Yes, I think I'm recording. Okay, hello everyone. I'm going to talk about empire today. Why empire? Because we hear so much about the American empire now. Up until a few years ago, people did not say openly, outright, the American empire. It was sort of whispered more for those who were perhaps against American foreign policy or something like that. It is really an empire, you know. But it seems that gradually, at the moment, even they themselves are talking about the American empire. I was thinking about empires. And up until now, really, if I had to describe what an empire was and the differences of empires throughout the ages, my line was, for example, you had the Roman Empire and the Spanish Empire in the 15th century. And I would have said, okay, those types of empire were about like the Roman Empire, you just went out and conquered lands, and that is what they did. There were no nation states, as it were. We had no passports at that time. Okay, so going out and conquer other lands was actually applauded. It was prestigious. They gave you, if you were the general, they gave you a triumph and so on. So it was perfectly acceptable to go out and conquer lands. The Spanish Empire was pretty much in that vein. By the time the British Empire came along in the 18th, 19th century, that had changed. Westphalia, the individual nations that had taken place. And so it wasn't really about land as such. It was more about trade, let's put it in very general terms. So it wasn't so much that it had changed. The idea of empire had changed. Okay, so that would have been my definition of empire, that it had changed those two differences. Now, thinking about what is happening now with the American empire, I thought, okay, is it more like the previous ones or the later ones, more like the Spanish or more like the British? Now, you might say that is a stupid question. Well, because I put it this way because I'm trying to see what kind of empire the American empire is, because reading about this, once I got interested in the subject, I got hold of several books on empires written especially by an Argentinian historian and also by some Spanish ones, who differentiate, and they call it the traditional, the old-fashioned way was, they call it generative, or what they mean is civilizational. In other words, you expanded your civilization, your religion, your culture, your laws, your everything to these other lands that you conquered. And the main difference is that has changed, and the civilization is no longer the most important thing. But with the change from civilization to trade, the word that they use is civilizational empire or predatory empire. Well, yes, the word is actually already a little bit more than a little bit negative, but in other words, you use your power, what we say, for trade, but really to conquer, but not necessarily the land, but to conquer the resources, perhaps the culture too, but change the culture. But it's mainly about power and resources of that land, that then you are bringing it for your own benefit. It doesn't mean that didn't occur, obviously, with the Roman and the Spanish Empire, but mainly you extended they make this difference. So I thought, okay, so I can see how I could put the Roman and the Spanish Empire. I can see where I can put the British Empire on trade. What do I make of the American Empire? Is it one, the other, or is it both together? So anyway, so I started reading about these things. And I thought, okay, I have to do a video on this. But of course, I cannot deal with these empires all in one video. So I said, okay, so I thought, this is my way of thinking, okay? Oh, and at the same time, I receive, I received this lovely card from my daughter in California, and she tells me that she was in the mission San Luis Rey in California, one of the missions. Yeah, okay. So this empire thing was on my mind for the last couple of days. And I said, okay, so I'm going to then deal with the American empire. How do I deal with that? How do I start talking about that? And inevitably, you have to go to the very beginning of the country, how the country started. I'm not going to go into the whole, independence war and so on, but the main ideology of the country, of how the country was founded, what happened at the very beginning of it all. And I couldn't avoid reading about the indigenous Indian tribes. Now, we used to call them, of course, we refer to them as the Native Americans or the indigenous people or the different wording. Now, I don't have any problem with that. I'm going to sometimes, when I talk about them, say still the old word Indian, because that is what is in official documents of the time, the lore of the Indus, so the Indian reservation. So the word Indian comes up. I mean, no, if it is disrespectful, if it is considered disrespectful, that is not obviously my aim. So I'm going to, only because it is written like that in official documents. So the native peoples of North America, what later became the United States of America. Okay, so they used to be called Indians. Then, as I said, in the 20th century, indigenous people, Native Americans, etc. So what happened to the indigenous people, those Native Americans, the inhabitants of those territories that were annexed to the United States, and what happened in the rest of the United States later on? So I'm going to talk about that. And I will be quoting from I'm following several books, but mainly one Argentinian historian, Jorge Abelardo Ramos. And he says, to begin with, the term extermination here is not exaggerated. It reflects a concrete reality. The practice of scalping, for example, what is scalping? Is the act of cutting or tearing a part of the human scalp with hair attached from the head. And generally, and they would do this to the Indians, and generally occurred there in warfare. And the scalp of an Indian being a trophy. I quote, "The practice of scalping spread throughout the territory we call today the United States when the white settlers began to offer big rewards to anyone who presented the scalp of an Indian, whether man, woman, or child. in 1703, the Massachusetts government paid 12 pounds sterling per scalp. And it was such an attractive amount that the organized hunt of Indians with horses and packs of dogs soon became a very profitable kind of national sport. The saying, which became later a motto, the best Indian is a dead Indian, was put into practice and became known. Yes, and it's born out. Is born not only from the fact that every exterminated, I'm going to use eliminated because you know the reasons, not only because everyone, if you eliminated that Indian, was one less nuisance for the new owners of the country, but also from the fact that the authorities themselves paid very well for that scalp. Okay, so how did the US do this? What happened between the white settlers and the Indians then? Why the phrase, the best Indian is a dead Indian, practically became the motto of an, elimination, and later of the racial segregation of the Indians in the United States of North America. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history here, which is rather revealing and it's actually rather disturbing too. The Declaration of Independence, the 13 colonies from Great Britain, drafted by the Continental Congress and signed on the 4th of July in 1776, established officially the image of North American Indians as, quote, bloodthirsty savages, from which it follows, logically, that the only policy to follow, since they were savages, was their elimination. The Declaration of Independence, which lists the specific abuses, the grievances that the Americans had against the English crown, okay, and the abuses as they saw them. It also lists the fact that they, in their mind, perhaps they had proof for it, the British Empire was actually encouraging the indigenous people to go against these new, independence-seeking colonies. And they say the British Empire, has encouraged internal insurrections against us and has tried to induce the inhabitants of our borders, the ruthless savage Indians, whose known rule of fighting or struggle or war is destruction without distinction of age, sex, or condition, end of quote. This meant that for these North American separatists, to begin with, the British Empire was actually inducing also the Indians against them, and that therefore, the extermination of these savage Indians was a way of ensuring their independence from the British too. In other words, they are going to be seen from the very beginning as their enemies and then as foreigners. Let me continue. And this is how they understood it from the very beginning. And therefore, the Declaration of Independence of the US, from its very beginning in its writing, is bathed really, with almost blood of Indians. Not only of the Indians, but also of course, the the slaves from sub-Saharan Africa. But that is, I'm not going to deal with that in this video at all. So I'm just going to deal with the indigenous people, with the Native Americans, or the Indians as we call them then. But in order to assess correctly the weight of this accusation, ruthless savages, it is important to bear in mind that the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson and then corrected by John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, okay? In the drafting committee, there was also included Robert Livingston and Roger Sherman, more about his descendants later on. But these last two did not actually participate in the actual preparation of the official declaration of the official act delivered to Congress on June 28, 1776. The 5 members of the drafting committee of the declaration, together with George Washington, are considered now the founding fathers of the United States. Adams was, besides, the second president of the United States, and Jefferson would be the third. It is not illogical, therefore, to think, based on these historical credentials, that the extermination policy of the North American Indians was really state policy. And that is how the founding fathers saw it. In 1789, George Washington was elected the first president, and he decided that all these Indian affairs were to be under the Secretary of the Secretariat, the Ministry of War, the War Ministry, the War Department, I suppose, under the war, yeah. Brigadier General Henry Fox, who is an independence hero, when George Washington appointed him first Secretary of War, he made it clear that the Indians were not and could not be North American citizens, and therefore the Indian tribes should maintain a consideration, he said, similar to that of other foreign nations. So they were foreign nations, but not only foreign nations inside the nation who were enemies because they were being induced by the British to go against them. So they are seen from the very beginning as enemies, not necessarily just as people who are there and you need to conquer, but as enemies working against the state. I think this is crucial. For these founding fathers, the Indians were not part of the United States, nothing to do with this new nation, not really a part of it. This means that from the very Declaration of Independence of the United States, what later became the motto, as I said, of the best Indian is a dead Indian, and Indians were not considered not only not citizens of the US, but not even potential citizens in the future. We will see later on that they didn't become full citizens until 1924. They were not allowed to vote until 1948, I believe. I will go through these dates later. But certainly at that time, they could never even be considered to be United States citizens. we must say something else here too. That it is argued, we may agree or disagree, but it is argued that this will later be copied by other empires in other places. Historians mention the British, the French, the Belgian, the Dutch colonial empires later in Africa and Asia. Or even we could go to World War II and National Socialism. Yeah. It is argued that this stand of Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin inspired what the later colonial empires did in the 19th and 20th century. We may disagree with that, certainly the extent to which it was done. But let us continue with the US, because there is quite a lot of history here, and it's at times it is disturbing. The Indian Removal Act, that is how they wrote it, Removal Act. It sounds like, you know, your removal service, but this is what it was called. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 took their land and forced them then into reservations. Let's go through a little bit of history here. Under this same act in 1838, for example, 17,000 Cherokees Indians were forced to leave their homes in northern Georgia and forced to move walking on foot from northern Georgia to Oklahoma. Everybody knows this, everyone in the United States, little kids learn about this. The deportation of the Cherokee people, that is the forced march by hundreds and hundreds of kilometers through inhospitable areas in the midst of horrendous snowfalls. All these caused the death of many, many of them, victims of hunger, thirst, and cold. The Cherokees traveled more than 1,600 kilometers in the harshest part of winter. On the way died around 4,000, the majority, of course, elderly women and children. This terrible march of the Cherokee people to the reservation designed for them, forced, let us not forget, forced by the government, went down in history as the Trail of Tears that every school child knows about. I went to AI and I say, okay, tell me a little bit more about this Indian Removal Act. And it does say, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 was a law that allowed the United States government to remove Native Americans from their homelands and relocate them to reservations west of the Mississippi River. The act was signed into law by President Andrew Jackson on May 28, 1830. And it adds a little bit more, just for your interest, how the act worked. The act allowed the president to grant land to tribes that agreed to give up their homelands. Well, okay, you give up your homeland and I'll give you this other land here. Okay. The act included incentives like financial assistance and protection from the government. They were certainly persuading them. The act allowed the government to bribe, threaten, or persuade tribes into signing treaties. they were deceived a number of times about treaties and things. What happened after the act passed? The act led to the forced removal of thousands of Native Americans, including members of the Cherokee, Muskogee, Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations. Many Native Americans died during the Trail of Tears, a devastating journey west that included exposure to heavy rains, snow, and freezing temperatures. And it adds, this is not me, this is AI. The act was part of a policy of ethnic cleansing and genocide against Native Americans. Okay, so with this removal act, the government put in place let's say an ethnic cleansing policy, since the objective was the expulsion of all Indian tribes to the west of the Mississippi River. The authorities in Washington maintained clear the territory between the Appalachians and the Mississippi of all indigenous presence, so that it could be repopulated by, for the most part, Protestant white citizens of the US and eventually immigrants to the country. After many presidents after Washington, Adams, and Jefferson participated also in this process of cleansing, including actually the one who went down in history as the person who ended the slavery of blacks in the USA after the Civil War, or the War of Secession, whichever you want to call it, the Republican President Abraham Lincoln. It is not usually told that Lincoln, at the age of 23, when he was 23 years old, and with the rank of captain, participated in the war against the Indian chief Black Hawk. Black Hawk. Okay, I went to, again, AI. I have some notes here, but I went to see whether, correct, or exaggerated or something. So I went to, you can look it up yourselves. Black Hawk, AI tells me, led the Sauk people. He was a war leader for the Sauk during the War of 1812. Black Hawk also led the Sauk and the Black Hawk War of 1832. Who was he? Black Hawk was born Makataime Sekayakiak in 1767 near the Rock River in Illinois. He fought against the United States in the War of 1812. He believed that the 1804 Treaty of St. Louis was invalid and that the Sauk and Fox people did not give up their land to the United States. We will see that a little bit later, because in the 1804 Treaty, the United States claimed that that land that they took, we'll talk about it a little later, was actually, they hadn't stolen it. It was given to them by their people, by the Sauk people. And Black Hawk said, no, he was probably a traitor, or he was probably just someone else. We have the name and everything else, but he said, no, the people never agreed to that. So he didn't believe that the treaty was valid. Anyway, Black Hawk is going to be imprisoned and then allowed to return to Iowa, where he died in 1838. The Sauk and their allies, the Fox, the Kickapoo, and the Ho-Chunk, they also called the Winnebago peoples, led by Black Hawk, resisted being evicted from their ancestral lands. And for months, they fought to avoid being expelled west of the Mississippi River. I have a lot of info here, but it was just really more for my information. Okay. Black Hawk War, it is called, a brief but bloody war from April to August of 1832 between the United States and Native Americans, led by Black Hawk, a 65-year-old Sauk warrior who in early April led some 1,000 Sauk, Fox, and Kickapoo men, women, and children, including about 500 warriors, across the Mississippi River to reclaim land in Illinois that tribal spokesmen had surrendered to the US in 1804, probably deceived or bought. Yeah. The band's crossing back into Illinois spurred fear and anger among white settlers, and eventually a force of some 7,000 mobilized against them, including members of the US Army, state militias, and warriors from various other Indian peoples. Some 450 to 600 Indians and 70 soldiers and settlers were killed during the war. By 1837, all surrounding tribes had fled to the west, leaving most of the former Northwest Territory to white settlement. Among those who participated in various roles during the war were a number of men who would figure prominently in the U.S. history, including future U.S. Presidents Abraham Lincoln and Zachary Taylor, longtime military leader and presidential candidate Winfield Scott, and Jefferson Davis, who would become president of the Confederate States of America. The background to this 1804 treaty is at the center of the Black Hawk War was a treaty between the Sauk and the Fox peoples and the United States that had been signed in St. Louis in November 1804, by which the Indians, the Americans claimed, agreed to cede to the United States all of their lands east of the Mississippi and some claims west of it. Okay. Okay, so Black Hawk said that this had never taken place. This was invalid. So when the US insisted on the validity of the treaty, it obviously strained an already tense relationship. Many Sauk and Fox people who had been pleased when the Americans replaced the Spanish in Louisiana in 1804 fought for the British in the War of 1812. Nevertheless, under the terms of the treaty, the Indians could remain on their land as long as it was in the possession of the United States government, that is, until private settlers could purchase it. There's a lot going on here, yes. Okay. So, the war began exactly on April 6th, 1832, with the Battle of what is called Stillman's Run, and continued until the savage massacre in Bad Axe, which took place on the 2nd of August of the same year, 1832. Now, what are these two battles? The Battle of Bad Axe and the Battle of Stillman's Run were both part of the Black Hawk War of 1832, a conflict, as I said, between American settlers and the Sauk and Fox Native Americans. The war took place in Illinois and Wisconsin. The Stillman's Run took place on May 14th, involved 1832 in Stillman Valley, Illinois, involved the Illinois militia and the Black Hawks Sauk Indian Band. Major Isaiah Stillman and his 275 militiamen were attacked by an unknown number of Sauk warriors. This is what AI is telling me. The militia fled back to Dixon's Ferry after 12 men were killed. The battle site is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And the Battle of Bad Axe took place between May and August in 1832. It involved the Sauk and Fox Native Americans and the United States military. The battle was named after its proximity to the mouth of the Bad Axe River. The first day of the battle began when Native Americans raised the white flag to the steamboat Warrior, but the Warrior opened fire on the natives. The second day of the battle was the Bad Axe Massacre. The Black Hawk War was a conflict over land. The federal and state governments insisted that the Sauks and Fox people had no remaining rights to the land in Illinois. Okay, so that is AI. So following the battle that occurred, the Battle of Wisconsin Heights that occurred in July 21st, 1832, in which the United States, defeated the captured Black Hawk, the Sauk tried to flee west. But on August the 1st in Bad Axe, they were overtaken by the U.S. Army and the Illinois militias. More than 400 women and children, elderly, were actually mercilessly assassinated here. It was a little bit of a rampage here. You can see now hatred and all those, emotions. Later, the soldiers dismembered the corpses and cut long strips of flesh to use as razor blades. Several dozen Sauk and Fox who had managed to flee were captured and killed by Sioux warriors acting in support of the U.S. In the weeks following the battle, the Sioux brought 68 Indian scalps and 22 prisoners to them. The North American Army suffered 5 killed in action and 19 wounded. Black Hawk, who had been himself taken prisoner in Wisconsin Heights, here you're going to see the disturbing horror, okay? He was taken prisoner, the leader, and was actually taken around as if in a circus, exhibited and displayed in several cities in Western United States as if he was a strange monkey, historian says, or an African gorilla. And crowds came from far and wide to see him. He wasn't the last one, since later on it was the turn of other mythical leaders like Sitting Bull and Geronimo. Black Hawk died on the 3rd of October, 1838, and was buried in the banks of the Des Moines River. In July 1839, James Turner stole the remains of the Indian chief and boiled them to separate the flesh from the bone and be able to exhibit the skeleton of the Sauk leader as a trophy. Okay, so that is to say, before the War of Secession, before the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, the United States of North America, now independent from the British Empire, started, let us say, a number of wars. Wars against whom? Wars against indigenous people, ethnic groups of the entire territory, which they intended, in any case, to conquer until reaching the Pacific Ocean. There is more. The war between the United States against the Sauk and the Fox and the Winnebago and the Kickapoo tribes would go down in history as the Black Hawk War, which, as we have seen, ended in, well, extermination. Besides Abraham Lincoln participated in this war, as well as Colonel Zachary Taylor, the future president of the United States between 1849 and 1850. Lincoln was president until 1865, when he was assassinated. The young Lieutenant Jefferson Davis, who would be senator for the state of Mississippi, Secretary of War between 1853 to 1857, and then President of the Confederate States from 1861 to 1864, and General Winfield Scott, considered a national hero for his participation in the war against Mexico between 1846 and 48, was himself candidate for the presidency in the elections of 1852. First commander in the chief of the armies of the North in the War of Secession, and the first military officer to hold the rank of lieutenant general after George Washington. They all participated. The carnage of bad acts was not an isolated case in the so-called conquest of the West. The list of massacres of Indian women and children documented and awarded by the government of the US is endless. In mid-1864, the authorities of Colorado signed a peace and security treaty with the Cheyenne chief Black Kettle. Chief Black Kettle was the Cheyenne leader who led the Sand Creek camp during the Sand Creek massacre of 1864. Let's go to the explanation. Black Kettle was a member of the Cheyenne Council of 44 chiefs. He was a peace advocate who tried to negotiate with the American government and military. In 1861, Black Kettle and the Arapaho surrendered to the Fort Lyon commander under the Treaty of Fort Wise. However, the treaty was unfavorable to the Southern Cheyenne. On November 29, 1864, Colonel John Chivington, I'm not sure, led 600 Colorado militiamen to attack the Sand Creek camp. This is going also to the Sand Creek massacre, is also going to go down in history as the other one. The attack killed 148 Native Americans, many of whom were women and children. This event is also known as the Chivington Massacre. Okay, so people are now able to settle near Sand Creek. However, on 29th of November of that year, 700 soldiers of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry Regiment, led by Colonel John Chivington, attacked the Cheyenne village by surprise. They had reached an agreement, okay, you can stay here, but then they were attacked by surprise. 60 Indian warriors died in combat, and 140 women and children were assassinated. Again, the terror. The soldiers of the 3rd Cavalry Regiment not only scalped the Cheyenne fighters, but also mutilated the bodies of Indian women, cutting off their ears and their breasts. This practice, where bodies were mutilated as a war trophy, came from, they reckon here, AI, I don't know, from earlier colonial times and the wars between England and France for control of North America, both the part that later came Canada and the part that then became the United States. So this had happened before. Okay, there is worse. Colonel Chivington was not a social misfit. He had enlisted as a volunteer in the US Army with a high rank. Chivington was a Methodist pastor and a member of the executive board of the Colorado Seminary, the historical precursor of the University of Denver today. He did receive much criticism, though, for the massacre at Sand Creek. Still, in 1887, nevertheless, a small town was founded in his honor that bears his name in Kiowa County in the state of Colorado. The city of Chivington, which began as a railway station, is today practically abandoned, but still stands in memory of the author of the massacre at Sand Creek. Captain Soul, who was actually moved as a human being to see what was happening, he said what happened at Sand Creek. When he reported the events, he claimed, and this is officially documented, he claimed that hundreds of women and children would come to us, would approach us. They would kneel before us, begging for mercy. And nevertheless, we who claim, he says, who claim to be civilized, would go and break their heads open. The Battle of Sand Creek occurred during the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, who nonetheless continued with the racial segregation of the Indians. In 1862, Lincoln ordered the hanging of up to 32 Sioux chiefs, the biggest, actually, mass execution in the history of the country, of 32 chiefs together. So he didn't end it, he continued it. How? The territorial and racial segregation of the Indians consisted in the forced deportation of the Indian tribes from their historic lands and their transfer to tiny reservations where they were condemned to live off the handouts from the North American state. that provided them, sometimes late, sometimes poorly, sometimes never, with the food that they could no longer procure for themselves through hunting, which is what they did, and scarce agriculture, the scarce agriculture that they practiced. Thus, the Lincoln administration, the federal government, practiced actually the cleansing of also the Navajo people, who were forced to walk in inhumane conditions more than 500 kilometers from their lands in Arizona to a place located east of New Mexico known as Bosque Redondo, the round forest, as it were. Okay. What had happened to the Cherokees was repeated with the Navajos to implement the eviction from their former lands between August of 1864 and the end of 1886. Lincoln had already been assassinated. There are two chiefs, Manuelito and Barboncito. They have Spanish names from the Mexican. So they fought against deportation before what they call the Larga Caminata, the long march to Bosque Redondo. The army organized 53 marches, which went down in history as the long walk to Bosque Redondo without food and water. Thousands of Navajos died before reaching New Mexico. The Bosque Redondo was a place of interment for the Navajo people after the long walk of 1864. The Treaty of Bosque Redondo, signed in 1868, ended the Navajo Wars and established the Navajo as a sovereign nation within the nation, a nation within a nation. So for the American political elite imbued with the so-called Manifest Destiny, their obligation was to build a continental state from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from 1800 to 1890, so that more than 500 Indian tribes, among them the Sauk, the Fox, Winnebago, Kickapoo, Iroquois, Huron, Sioux, Cheyenne, Cherokees, Navajos, Apaches, Comanches, and many others, were obviously an obstacle that had to be eliminated. From then, historians differ on the numbers, but an average of 10 million Indians who populated the current territory of the United States at the moment of its independence from Great Britain. Almost 100 years later, in 1890, there were only 228,000 survivors. In fact, all those movies about the far west, Western cowboys, the cowboy movies, they actually, what they did was to justify or glorify that segregation or that elimination that was done to the Indians. Because to them, they were not only foreign agents at the service of England, but even foreigners at the service of themselves and opposed to the Union, to the power exercised by Washington. So they were always enemies. They were seen as enemies. There were more ignominious episodes in the conquest of the West. The Battle of the Battle of Washita in 1868. Black Kettle and George A. Custer. Custer would become a legendary figure One of the glorious episodes of that gesture, of that feat, is like the song of Roland or the meal feed, the seed. it was made into something like that. This gesture took place on the 27th of November in 1868 in the shores of the Washita River, when the 7th Cavalry Regiment, led by General George Custer, attacked by surprise one of the Cheyenne encampments, massacring the Indian warriors, and with them all women and children. There was no mercy even for pregnant women or newborn babies who were crushed by horses' hoofs. They run over them on purpose to crush them in order, he said, to save ammunition. After the massacre on the Washita River, General Custer earned the nickname Squaw Killer, Redskins assassin, a nickname he always carried with pride until his death. More about him in a second, but General William Sherman, a supporter of acting with a heavy hand against the Cheyenne Indians, promoted General Custer at the beginning, had promoted him at the beginning of 1867 to be at the head of the 7th Regiment. General Sherman was a direct descendant of Roger Sherman, who took part in the Committee of the Five who drafted the Act of Declaration of Independence. Of the draft, not the official document, but of the draft. He was there where Indians were specifically described in this draft as ruthless savages. In any case, 8 years after the massacre by the Washita River massacre, on the 25th of June, 1876, General Custer and 252 men of the 7th Cavalry Regiment found their death at the Battle of Little Big Horn at the hands of chiefs Shoe, Sitting Bull, and Crazy Horse. The bodies of the general and his soldiers were buried on the same battlefield, but in October of 1877, Custer's remains were relocated to West Point Cemetery in New York. Okay, so they themselves were attacked. Later, they died and they were buried. His remains relocated, transferred. And from that moment on, numerous documents dedicated to General Custer were monuments, not documents, many monuments were built to his name, to his honor, throughout the United States. General Custer, yeah? The most important of these in the city of Monroe in the state of Michigan. In 1917, the Fort Custer National Military Reservation was built in his honor. This was where 90,000 soldiers who participated in World War I and 400,000 soldiers who fought in World War II were trained. In 1917, was the Fort Custer National Cemetery was built. Okay. One of the last, in 1890, let me tell you about what happened in 1890. On the 15th of December of 1890, the Sioux chief Sitting Bull had been assassinated on the Standing Rock Reservation. Fearing that he would be next, another chief, Chief Bigfoot decided to flee the reservation with his people to try to join his forces with another chief, Red Cloud. The American army received precise instructions to avoid the two chiefs meeting, the two Indian leaders meeting, to try by whatever means. And on 28th of December, the army caught up with Bigfoot and his tribe. On the morning of December the 29th, the 7th Cavalry, commanded by James Forsyth, attacked the Sioux encampment near Wounded Knee. About 150 Sioux warriors were killed and 25 Americans. The army troops assassinated more than 200 non-combatants, mostly women and children. Nevertheless, the reaction of the government and of American society as a whole was extremely favorable. Bigfoot, actually, when you see photographs of him, there are quite a few photographs of him with his wife, Blanca. And he actually always has a cross hanging because he had become under the Mexican Spanish, well, the Mexican jurisdiction. He had converted to Christianity, so you can see his cross very clearly. It's a fascinating story, but anyway, okay, so he had been baptized. Anyway, on January the 3rd in 1891, January 3rd, 1891, Lidman Frank Baum, you know him because he's famous for children's books, the author, among others, of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. He was also a newspaper editor, the editor of the Saturday Pioneer. And as editor of the newspaper, he wrote, quote, "The Pioneer, the newspaper, declares," this comes from the author of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. "The Pioneer declares that our security depends only on the total extermination of the Indians. Having been harmed for centuries, it is better, in order to protect our civilization, to persist in error and erase these indomitable creatures from the face of the earth." You know, a dead Indian is, the best Indian is a dead Indian, kind of following. It's a history written in blood. More. Perhaps we can say, without fear of exaggerating too much, that Americans actually celebrated with joy the victory at Wounded Knee because it put an end to the so-called Indian War. On July 25th, July 25th, 1893, near Waters Hall, with the assistance of more than 1,500 people, a memorial was erected in honor of the 7th Cavalry Regiment who fell in Wounded Knee. Shortly afterwards, on November 9th, 1894, Colonel James Forsyth was promoted to Brigadier General, and on 11th of May, 1897, to Major General. To this day, small town in Montana, in Rosebud County, still bears his name. Finally, it should be noted that 20 more members of the 7th Cavalry Regiment were awarded by President Benjamin Harrison the Medal of Honor, the highest decoration awarded by the U.S. Armed Forces. The criteria used to grant such honor is to have acted with bravery and boldness at the risk of one's life, beyond the call of duty, while in combat against an enemy of the United States. Years later, Hollywood, following the example of a lot of intellectuals and great men in American culture, Hollywood would be responsible also to present the conquest of the West as a hero in the film. The first film in honor of Custer, General Custer. It's called, perhaps you have heard of it, the Santa Fe Trail in 1940, directed by Michael Curtiz. And actually, the future president of the United States, Ronald Reagan, played the role of the brave General Custer, the one who went with his horses over people to save ammunition. A year later, in 1941, there was another film, the one that really became more famous. They Died with Their Boots On. And the 1941 film about the life of General George Armstrong Custer is titled They Died with Their Boots On. It was directed by Raoul Walsh and stars Errol Flynn as Custer. The plot of the movie is, just to give you see how it is how history is presented in popular culture. The plot of the movie is a fictionalized account of Custer's life from his time at West Point in 1857 to his death at the Little Big Horn Battle in 1876. And Custer is a rebellious soldier who disobeys orders, but, the anti-hero, but has many successes during the Civil War. After the war, he marries Livy Bacon, Olivia de Havilland, and is assigned to the Dakota Territory. Custer tries to negotiate honestly with the Sioux peoples, but corruption leads to a battle with Sitting Bull's forces. The most famous of all films is this one specifically is designed to honor Custer. He is presented as cheerful, gallant gentleman, a little bit of a joker, courageous to the point of irrationality. The film contributed to consolidate among Americans the idea of the conquest of the West as the founding feat, the founding gesture of the United States of America. And they're right, because the US as a continental state was created thanks to that conquest of the West. But also a conquest which included extermination, elimination, etc., of the people who lived throughout the Holy Territory, the whole territory, and managed to conquer the land all the way to the Pacific. A large part of it is what was previously had been half of the territory of Mexico, or New Spain. The Mexico was the name of a city, a capital, but the whole country was not called that until the 19th century, I think. But in any case, it was the territory of Mexico. And here I have to introduce another character, Joel Roberts Poinsett, who is described in some history books as the worst possible enemy of Mexico, the person who did most harm to Mexico in all these wars of, the Mexican-American wars before, after, and all the rest of it, is this guy, Joel Roberts Poinsett. Why do I stop here? Because you probably at Christmas have the poinsettia plant. Yeah, that beautiful red plant, Christmas. Well, it comes from him, Joel Roberts Poinsett, namesake of the poinsettia, but he was also an enslaver, a secret agent, and perpetrator of the Trail of Tears. And I have here an interesting article written by Lindsay Schackenbach-Regel, an assistant professor of history at Miami University. And she tells us a little bit about this character. If people know the name Joel Roberts Poinsett today, it is likely because of the red and green poinsettia plant. In the late 1820s, while serving as the first ambassador from the US to Mexico, Poinsett clipped samples of the plant known in Spanish as the Flor de Nochebuena, or flower of Christmas Eve, from the Mexican state of Guerrero. He then introduced it to the United States on a trip home from Mexico. The plant has been named poinsettia ever since. But much like the history of the United States, Poinsett had a complex and troubling past. An ambitious politician, financial investor, and enslaver, Poinsett was a secret agent for the US government in South America, who fought for the Chilean army against Spain during Chile's War of Independence in the early 1800s. Well, we see the Americans here very much in favor of the independence movements. It was in their interest to break it up into, all right, that's another video. A confidant of President Andrew Jackson, Poinsett also served as U.S. Secretary of War under President Martin Van Buren and oversaw the ignominy of the Trail of Tears, the forced relocation and deadly march of Cherokee people from the South to reservations in the West during the 1830s. And yet Poinsett, an avid botanist who brought scores of other plants to the US, also helped found an organization that led to the creation of the Smithsonian Institution. A privileged life. I came across she says, his history almost by accident. I am a historian of capitalism in early America, and while I was on a research fellowship for my first book, Manufacturing Advantage, War, the State, and the Origins of American Industry, that's the title of the book, another researcher suggested I go to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania to check out the papers of a few War Department officials. Poinsett was one of those officials. There, I found a large collection of his letters and other personal papers that spanned 5 decades of his life. I became so fascinated with his life that I decided to write a book about him. I detail his complicated life in another book, Flowers, Guns, and Money, Joel Roberts Poinsett and the Paradoxes of American Patriotism. Born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina, on March 2nd, 1779, Poinsett was the son of a wealthy doctor and lived a life of privilege. He traveled throughout Europe and Russia in his early 20s before starting a military career. In the 1810s, Poinsett traveled around South America as a secret agent of the United States State Department. His intelligence reports led in part to the drafting of the Monroe Doctrine. that doctrine, written by Secretary of State John Adams and buried in President James Monroe's address to Congress on the 2nd of December, 1823, sought to prevent European colonization in South America and, in essence, claimed the entire Western Hemisphere for the US. Basically, the United States were basically to exercise control over the whole continent by fair means or foul. The doctrine also set the stage for 2 centuries of rocky relations between the US and Latin America. In 1825, the article continues, the Monroe administration appointed Poinsett as the nation's first ambassador to Mexico. He arrived there in the spring of that year and almost immediately instigated a general distrust of American interference. He used his connections to secure favorable plots of land for himself and his friends, and established a US-based mining company to exploit Mexican resources for his own benefit, etc., etc. You can find this online, okay? In any case, there were many more massacres, such as the massacre of the California Indians by the American Army since 1846, when the US snatched really California from Mexico. And among them is the massacre in the Sacramento River on April 6, 1846. The Battle of Yerba Buena, the US, let me see. Okay, this won't take very long. Okay. The battle, they call it the massacre in the Sacramento River on April 6, 1846. The Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, took place in several locations, including Texas, New Mexico, California, and Mexico City. Some of the battles that took place during the war include, some of them, the Battle of Yerba Buena. The US Navy occupied Yerba Buena, which is now San Francisco, California, on July 10, 1846. The Battle of Monterrey. Zachary Taylor's forces forced Pedro de Ampudia to surrender Monterrey from September 21st to 23 in 1846. The Battle of Palo Alto on May 8th. The Battle of Buena Vista, this is already in 1847. And the Battle of Cerro Gordo in 1847. It goes on. Okay. In any case, the war resulted in the United States annexing a huge amount of territory from Mexico. What is that territory? Not all, but it included California, Texas, New Mexico, Utah, Arizona, Nevada, parts of Colorado, Oklahoma, Kansas, Wyoming. Montana is not here. Montana is Montana mountain, yeah? Florida, okay. So basically imagine the whole South, yeah? So, okay. So many of these massacres under the direction of one single man, Captain John Fremont, friend and protege of the influential American diplomat and politician Joel Robert Poinsett of the Poinsettia, the man who did more harm to Mexico than any other. The atrocities carried out by Fremont, far from damaging his image in public opinion, actually catapulted him to politics. In fact, he was senator for California in 1850, the first candidate to the presidency presented by the Republican Party in 1856, and governor of the Arizona Territory in 1878. In his honor, a city of Nebraska in Dutch County still bears his name, and he was not alone because Captain Edward Kern was also together with him, the people responsible for the massacre. Kern and Sutter, March 29, 1847, another battle, the St. Philip River was renamed Kern River in homage to in his name, yeah. And a county in California also kept his name. The Constitution of California in 1849. Well, in April 27, 1850, the new legislature of the state of California had approved the Act for Governance and Protection of the Indians that legalized the kidnapping and forced servitude of Indians by white settlers. The Act for Governance and Protection of the Indians legalized kidnapping and forced servitude of Indians by white settlers. In 1856, an editorial of the San Francisco Bulletin stated that, quote, when an outbreak of Indian violence, when there is an outbreak of Indian violence, extermination is the fastest and cheapest and most effective remedy to prevent all other difficulties. End of quote. And after all this, well, when was American citizenship granted to the North American Indians? The date speaks for itself. The Indians of the United States, the Native Americans of the United States, became full citizens only from the 2nd of June, 1924. Okay, I don't want to go into that. I was going to compare it to something else, but no. Okay. On the same day of June the 2nd, 1924, the US Congress approved the so-called Indian citizenship law, the Indian citizenship law, but the right to vote in all states of the Union was not granted to the Native American peoples until the year 1948. 30 years later, in 1978, with the American Indian Religion Freedom Act, the American Indians were allowed to celebrate some religious ceremonies, although freedom of worship was not recognized until 1993 with the Native American Free Exercise of Religion Act. I have a story here. They were allowed certain religious ceremonies, in 1978. I remember in 1985, my husband and I were driving from California all the way to North Carolina, taking our time. And there in the mountains of the Sierras of Arizona, there were, I think I told you this story, but it must have been a year ago. There were, you could see pamphlets and notes and notices saying that the reservation of the Indians, were they were celebrating some feast or other. Okay. And we thought it would be interesting to actually go there. And they allowed, it was an exception, they allowed sort of whites to come and kind of watch a little bit. And we were there, and they were with their full costumes and the plumes and the full Indian costume as you see it in photographs. They were actually celebrating something official. Okay. And they were dancing round. Okay. And I was surprised because I saw a priest there, a Catholic priest. So I went to speak to him, and I asked, I said, what are they, because they were dancing. Okay, they were got like this and like this, going round and round. And I asked the priest, I said, what are they celebrating? And because I thought they were celebrating perhaps a battle or something. And the priest said, they're praying. Oh, they're praying. And all right, it took me by surprise. They were praying, and then we started talking, and yeah, he asked me, who I was, where I came from. My husband was there, and he said, oh, so you were born in Spain. Well, there is a woman here who speaks Spanish. And he went and introduced me to this very, very, very old lady. She was ancient. If you can picture, the very old faces, and she was there sitting down. And he introduced me to her, and he said she can speak Spanish. And I said, oh, really? And we started speaking Spanish. And his Spanish was pretty good, broken Spanish, but perfectly understandable. And I was so surprised. And I didn't know how to, because the question was going to sound stupid. How did you learn Spanish? This was an old Indian woman. It wasn't as if she was going to night school. I didn't know how to ask the question, but I don't know how I did it. But I kind of said, how is it that you speak the language? And she looked at me. I remember her eyes, and she said, it is the old way. It is the old way, she said. It moved me to my core. I mean, it's just amazing. Anyway, it stayed with me. Her eyes. It's the old way. Okay, so anyway, so in 1993, they were completely free to exercise their religion, Native American Free Exercise of Religion Act. However, these advances in civil rights matters have not really changed the fact that they are still in reservations. And some claim they are vegetating there and slowly becoming extinct, although there are some tribes who have decided to open casinos and things to survive. Anyway, so look at the dates: 1924, 1948, 1978, and 1993. Only during those years, little by little, in the 20th century, the Indians gained citizenship, civil rights, citizen rights. Not until the 20th century were they recognized not only as humans, but as persons. Reservations, yes, okay. They're not concentration camps. They are free to, walk about and do things. The largest indigenous people in the US today are the Navajos. There are about 30,000 left. So what is the current situation in this Argentinian historian Marcelo Guyu's book, Madre Patria? Madre means mother in Spanish, yeah. Okay, so in his book, Madre Patria, he writes, today, that was 3 years ago, 2021, today, 42 of the whole Navajo population lives below the poverty line. 48% is unemployed. Income per capita is around $7,200 when the national average is around 30,000. Only 7% of the Navajo have a university degree, and even today, there are thousands of homes without electricity, and 40% of the population does not have access to running water. Crime rates on the reservations are alarming, higher than those in big cities like Boston or Seattle. The lack of resources and infrastructure often translates into difficulties, for example, inaccessible healthy food, so that almost 1/3 of the Iroquois suffer from diabetes. And what happened to Americans of Mexican origin who remained in what had been Mexican territory, and then their children and grandchildren, were born there? Well, between the years 1929 and 1940, so these, you're talking about the grandchildren or great-grandchildren of, almost 100 years earlier. Between the years 1929 and 1940, the government of the United States proceeded to deport a total of 418,969 what they call Hispanics, or people at the beginning was of Mexican origin. 60% of them were American citizens, having been born there, US citizenship, but they were deported nonetheless, applying the jurisprudence term jus soli to determine the nationality of American citizens. I'll explain. The term jus soli is a jurisprudence, legal term that in Latin, that refers to the principle of acquiring citizenship based on the place of birth, meaning a person is considered a citizen of the country where they're born, regardless of their parents' citizenship status. Essentially, it translates from the Latin as right of soil. The key points, I'm reading from, I think it's Britannica, the key points about jus soli are, meaning, jus means right in Latin, and solis means soil. So jus soli literally translates to right of the soil. How it works. If a country operates under jus soli, any child born within its territory automatically becomes a citizen, even if their parents are not citizens. Contrast that with jus sanguinis, from blood. The opposite principle is jus sanguinis, right of blood, which means citizenship is determined by the citizenship of one's parents, regardless of where they are born. Different countries will have different, legal laws on this, but the application in the United States, the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution largely establishes jus soli as the basis for citizenship in the United States. But in the between 1929 and 1940, 60% of American citizens of Mexican descent were deported. This massive unconstitutional expulsion of people of Mexican origin was carried out under the slogan, you always have slogans, once a Mexican, always a Mexican. So if you think about it, you can find a lot of racism in this phrase. It is the opposite of jus soli, which is you become a citizen regardless of your ethnic origin. And all this they did in the 13 colonies they were conquering as they were advancing towards the Pacific. Anyway, so this is, I'm going to end. I am studying because, you see, I wanted to see the very beginning of the American nation, which is based on getting rid of people. Okay, so I am wondering, I'm going to continue studying. I'm sorry, I'm putting my thoughts together here. Because this historian, Gustavo Bueno, distinguishes, as I said at the very beginning, between empires that generate civilizations or export civilizations and empires that are mainly predatory. You go there because you have power, because you have the means, you establish trade, you take resources, whatever it is. So you are a source of my wealth, as it were. So what I'm going to ask you is, where do you think that the United States falls, this United States empire? Could it be a bit of both? Because after all, you know, they do actually, you know, export their civilization, as it were, their form of thinking, their culture. It started in one way, it finishes with the liberal democracy and capitalism and so on. Where do you think? Is it a civilizational empire or a predatory empire or a new type of empire? A little bit of both. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.